Wasabi guys, Void here coming back at y'all with another Commander deck tech video. I am doing patron request for deck techs. This is the last month that I'm doing it, so March. To all my other patrons, you have until the very end of the month to put in your final deck tech requests. And Frogger Pirate has always given me some pretty cool deck tech ideas. He has a lot of awesome commanders. Over the past 5 or so months, I've been doing deck techs for him. And this time, he's given me a request that is just as interesting, if not even more interesting than anything he's ever requested. And that is Karona, False God. If you're not familiar with her, she is from Scourge. She is a 5/5 avatar legendary creature. All 5 colors of mana and 1 generic, so 6 total CMC. She has haste, and at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player untaps Karona and then gains control of her. Whenever Karona attacks, creatures of the type of your choice get +3/+3 until end of turn. She is an avatar, by the way, so you can always choose avatar and have her swing as a hasty 8/8, which isn't terrible. The only real downside to her is the fact that she doesn't really have trample. She doesn't really have any way of getting over creatures. She doesn't have flying, so she is susceptible to good blockers, and your opponents don't always have to be nice to you. They can just swing it into a trap and kill Karona. So that is the only real bummer with Karona, but we're going to be making 5-color chaos a thing with this deck, and I honestly think that Karona does work out pretty well, because chaos is about changing things up a bit, and each opponent getting a chance to swing with Karona is pretty cool. As always, we're going to take a look at our lands and see if there's anything important to mention. I think in 5 colors, you run the risk of putting a lot of money into your deck, but it's honestly worth it. Mana fixing is so important, so use your best judgment. If you want to spend a lot of money on it, you could obviously go for dual lands. That's the top of the line. You could go somewhere in the middle, settle for shock lands. I think those will do just fine. And if you're really on a budget, you can settle for those lands from Tarkir and Alara that come into play tap, but they tap for 3 different mana. Those are pretty budget, but you never know. The one land that I think is noteworthy to point out here is Homeward Path. If the wrong opponent gets their hands on Karona, you don't like them, Homeward Path will give you back your Karona, which I think is pretty important. And even outside of her, there are still a lot of cards that are going to be exchanging control of creatures. Sometimes they're going to go overboard with the chaos, and creatures are going to be all over the place. On to artifacts, we have a ton of them. We have Pyxis of Pandemonium, a really cool 1-mana artifact that can tap, and each player is going to exile the top cards of their libraries. And then whenever you feel like it, you can pay 7 mana to tap it to sacrifice it, and then each player is going to turn face up all cards that were exiled face down with Pyxis of Pandemonium, and then they put them all onto the battlefield, which is pretty insane. We of course play Soul Ring, Felwar Stone. Those 2 cards are pretty essential for any commander deck, really, but in 5 colors, Felwar Stone really stands out. Chances are your opponents are going to have a lot of your colors. We, of course, have Howling Mine. You can't really go wrong with this card, whether you want to play Chaos or you want to play Group Hug. The goal of the game isn't to make yourself the biggest target. You are giving your commander to your opponents, after all, so giving them extra card draw might be a good incentive to not attack you with your own commander. We have Chromatic Lantern because we are a 5-color deck. Not only does it ramp us up by 1, but it also makes it to where all of our lands are going to tap for the mana that we need. We have Commander Sphere, going to do pretty much the same thing, not for our lands, but can also sacrifice itself to draw us a card. Darksteel Ingot, another one that's also underrated, survives a lot of board wipe effects that are going to destroy artifacts, and it's always going to be there, it seems. Very difficult to get rid of it. Yet another 3-mana mana rock that's going to tap for what we need. We also play Fist of Suns. Instead of paying whatever mana cost for cards that we cast, we can instead pay 5 mana, 1 of each color, which is much cheaper considering we have a lot of expensive spells. Sometimes we don't want to spend too much mana, but if we have the right mana fixing, Fist of Suns is a perfect card. Boom Pile is chaotic. It's not like your typical Nevinyrral's Disc. This can destroy all non-land permanents, so it's a little bit better removal, but that risk factor of you losing the flip makes it a little bit more chaotic and a little bit more fun and entertaining. Of course, if you want a little bit more certain removal, you could throw in an Oblivion Stone or a Nevinyrral's Disc. That way you don't have to depend on a coin flip as to whether or not you can get back into a game, but I think it's a fun card. And of course, Chaos. Can't really go wrong with a good old Teferi's Puzzle Box. Everyone's going to be seeing something different. Your opponents who want to play control or combo are going to have to wait a little bit, or they're going to have to find a way to deal with the the puzzle box. It's a fun card. It forces your opponents to play on the fly sometimes. Really cool. Time Sifter, this one is funny. It can get out of hand really quickly. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, everyone's going to be removing the top card of their library from the game, and the player who removed the card with the highest CMC is going to take an extra turn, and if it's a tie, then they have to do it between them. So really chaotic. Getting extra turns is always going to be a pain, but I think it's just fun enough to where the same person is likely not going to get back-to-back-to-back turns unless their deck is just filled with high CMC cards. So I think it's pretty fun, pretty fair, and very chaotic. Gate to the Aether is also extremely chaotic, but this is going to be kind of a theme. We want to cheat in stuff for free, and sometimes that means we're going to allow our opponents to do the same. So it's kind of like Group Hug, but very chaotic Group Hug. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, they're going to reveal the top card of their library. If it's an artifact, creature, or enchantment, or a land card, they get to put that into play. So everyone's going to get some free stuff, hopefully. Knowledge Pool is fantastic. Each player is going to be exiling the top 3 cards of their library, and then from that point, each spell you play is going to be exiled, and then you're going to have to choose a card from the Knowledge Pool, the cards that are exiled in total, and then you're going to choose that card to then cast. And the card that you originally wanted to cast is going to be in exile, so the Knowledge Pool is always going to be filled. You just have to choose the right cards to cast. Really powerful card. And we, of course, have our last artifact here, Omen Machine. This card is kind of like Gate to the Aether, but instead of being able to draw a card afterwards, players can't draw cards at all. So any sort of combos that deal with drawing cards are useless. Fantastic card. Very similar to Gate to the Aether, where a lot of random things can happen, but pretty cool stuff will happen. We, of course, have some pretty cool creatures. Birds of Paradise. Obviously, this is a 5-color deck. Veteran Explorer. Pretty chaotic, giving everyone extra lands. Kind of group huggish, but allowing players to do more things is always going to be chaotic. Heartwood Storyteller, this is one of the cards that he wanted in the deck, and I can't blame him. You're going to be forcing your opponents to be cautious of whenever they want to play a non-creature spell. Each of their opponents is going to draw a card, so that is really cool. Mog Assassin is pretty underrated removal. You do have to flip a coin, but you can obviously collude with some players. If you happen to lose the flip, maybe they're not just going to destroy your Mog Assassin, but they might destroy a creature that's a little bit more problematic. And we have Stark of Wrath, which is kind of the same thing. You want to hopefully be reasonable, but you're going to be giving control of Stark of Wrath to someone else, the player that you destroy their artifact or creature. And the same thing happens when they want to destroy another artifact or creature. Then Stark of Wrath goes to that player. So you're giving removal to one player, and hopefully they're going to do the right thing by you and not just retaliate and then destroy something of yours. But yet again, pretty chaotic. Braids Conjurer Adept, kind of the same thing as Gate to the Aether. A little bit better though, because at the beginning of each player's upkeep, it's from their hand. So if they have an artifact, creature, or land card, they get to just put it into play, which can be quite chaotic, but we have a lot of cool spells, so that's pretty cool. Ruhan of the Fomori. I love putting multicolor cards into 4-color, 5-color decks like this, because flavor-wise, it's just a huge win. Very chaotic card, very chaotic commander. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you're going to choose an opponent at random and then swing at them. Ruhan of the Fomori is a 7/7, no keywords, but still is a presence on the board, and your opponents can't be too mad at you, but really awesome. And then we have Perplexing Chimera, going to be exchanging control with your opponent's spells, which is always going to be a presence. Whenever your opponents want to do something, they always have to be concerned, what are you going to do with this card? Blue cards like these are going to add to the chaotic theme. Progenitor Mimic. Sometimes getting more copies of the same creature, like a Perplexing Chimera, is just hilarious. Or even cards like Heartwood Storyteller, just to maximize the card draw you can get, I think is fantastic. And we have Arbiter of Nullridge to round out the creatures, has Vigilance, and when he enters the battlefield, each player's life total becomes the highest life total among all players, which is a pretty cool card to play when you're pretty much playing arch enemy. Someone has the highest life total, and they have a pretty good lead. Evening things out a bit can definitely save you and help out any potential allies in the game. Then we move on to the enchantments. We have 17 of them. We have Ghostly Prison and Propaganda. We are giving our commander to our opponents, so hopefully they don't just attack us. Making them pay 2 mana extra if they want to is a good deterrent. Planar Chaos, a little bit risky on your upkeep. Hopefully you get to keep it, and every time a player casts a spell, they have to flip a coin. If they lose it, that spell is countered. Very nerve-wracking. Uncertainty is one of those elements of chaos. Rites of Flourishing, Kind of group huggish, I know, but allowing players to do a lot of stuff quicker is going to increase the chaos. Endless Whispers, this card is awesome, and I think it might be the first black card we've looked at. Each creature has, when that creature dies, you have to choose an opponent, and then that player gets to have that creature come into play under their control from the graveyard. So the best creatures dying are going to come back only under an opponent's control, which is going to change things up, make things amazing. Puka's Mischief, kind of a steal effect. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may exchange control of target non-land permanent you control and target non-land permanent in opponent controls with an equal or lesser CNC. So hopefully you have a ton of other good non-land permanents that you can just give to your opponents that aren't really worth that much, or maybe the abilities that they have are pretty much just going to affect everyone and it doesn't really matter who has them, kind of like Howling Mine. So a lot of cool things you can do with Puka's Mischief. Confusion in the Ranks, this card is one of the reasons why we need to have a homeward path, because sometimes things are going to get a little out of hand, but whenever an artifact, creature, or enchantment comes into play, its controller chooses a target permanent that another player controls of the same type and then exchanges control with that permanent. So really just amazing how complicated the board state can be because of this card. Cards all over the place. I've seen people that scoop because of this card. I've scooped because of this card. It just gets out of hand pretty quickly, especially if there are tokens involved. Oh my gosh. Then we have Maelstrom Nexus. This card is brilliant. We are playing 5 colors after all, so you kind of have to. The first spell you play each turn has Cascade. This is each turn, so your opponent's turns as well. Getting more spells is always chaotic, especially when you don't know what they're going to be. Cascade is brilliant. Possibility Storm is one of the quintessential chaos cards in the format, and it definitely belongs in this deck. Whenever you cast a spell, you exile it, and then you remove cards from the top of your library until you reveal a card of the same card type. You end up having to play that card instead, and then you shuffle all of the exiled cards and put them on the bottom of your library, so pretty much just in a random order, and you're going to end up with a card that you really didn't want. So pretty cool. Definitely going to change things up a bit for control decks. Shared Fate, I love this card. It is really just the definition of chaos. You don't really care about your opponents playing your spells because usually you want to play your spells anyway. You don't really care about timing. But if a player would draw a card, that player removes the top card of an opponent's library from the game face down instead. Each player gets to look at and play cards that they removed from the game with Shared Fate, and they do that as if it were in their hand. So you get to choose the best player at the table or the person who has the best deck, and hopefully they have some good cards, and then you get to play them or not play them. You don't have to. You could just wait for your opponents to play your spells. But it's really weird. It's one of those weird cards that is definitely going to make your opponents hate you maybe, but either way, I don't feel guilty about playing this card. It's quite enjoyable at times. Conjured Currency, kind of like Puka's Mischief, but a little bit better because it's not really specific on CMC, and it doesn't have to be a non-land permanent. It just has to be Conjured Currency, so you can give that to a player, and that's in exchange for any target permanent you neither own or control. Dovescape, yet another one of the cards that he really wanted in here. Whenever a player plays a non-creature spell, counter it, and then they get to put X 1/1 white and blue bird creature tokens with flying into play, where X is the converted mana cost of the spell that was countered. So no one's getting what they want, so it really limits what they're able to do, but everyone's going to be getting, at the very least, a bunch of bird tokens. So I've seen a lot of people just laugh out loud because of this card. It's really out there, but in a 5-color deck, you can't always play this in a chaos build, so one of the reasons why I can see Frogger Pirate wanted to go into 5 colors. They have Grip of Chaos. Whenever a spell or ability is put into the stack, reselect its target at random if it has a single target. So if it's Swords to Plowshares and it's targeting one creature randomly, either you're going to roll a die or something like that, you're going to choose another creature, and Swords to Plowshares is going to hit that target instead. Havoc Festival, players can't gain life. I love this card, and it is also very chaotic, and it's going to end the game quickly if not dealt with pretty soon. At each player's upkeep, they're going to lose half of their life rounded up. Hive Mind, whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery, each other player copies that spell, and then they get to cast it and choose new targets. So the control players, they have to really be concerned about what they're doing, because this can get out of hand yet again. Wild Evocation, kind of like Braids, kind of like Gate to the Aether, a lot of those cards. This one is a little bit better. It's a little bit more explosive, kind of like Braids, where it is from the hand. That player reveals a card at random though, so it's not as precise, and if it is a land card, they put it onto the battlefield. Otherwise, they cast it without paying its mana cost. So brilliant card, very explosive. Eye of the Storm, kind of like Hive Mind, yet another cool blue enchantment that's going to fool around with instants and sorceries. You remove that card from the game whenever a player plays one, and then that player copies each instant or sorcery card removed from the game with Eye of the Storm. And for each copy, they get to play the copy without paying its mana cost. So a whole bunch of cards you can get off of this each time you want to cast an instant or sorcery. So thankfully, we have a bunch of those in this deck. Speaking of sorceries, we do have Demonic Tutor. Awesome card. We are playing 5 colors, one of the best cards you can play in any commander deck, so why not? If you have a really cool thing in mind, you can do it. Get whatever you need from your deck. Can't go wrong with that. Cultivate and Kodama's Reach are also pretty good staples in 5 colors. Gets you up to 2 basic lands from your deck, 1 onto the battlefield tapped and 1 to your hand. These are awesome setup cards. Pain's Reward is another cool black chaotic card. You bid any amount of life in turn order. Each player may top the high bid. The bidding ends if the high bid stands, and the high bidder loses life equal to the highest bid and draws 4 cards. So how much are people going to be willing to give up in terms of life to draw 4 cards? Chances are not everyone is. So if someone ends up paying 10 life for 4 cards, you really know who's desperate. Tempt with Discovery isn't as chaotic, but definitely getting yourself more lands. They do come into play untapped, but it's one of those cards where whoever is tempted, you get to search for another land card, so they have to be careful. You could end up with way too many lands. Illicit Auction, pretty cool way of exchanging control of a creature. If it's a really good one, if they really need it, they might have to pay the most life in order to keep it. So in turn order, the bid's just going to keep going. You start the bidding at 0, so it's going to be a little bit easier for you. But yeah, one of the more well-known chaotic cards in the format. Time Reversal, we don't really care too much about wheels for card advantage purposes, but rather to recycle anything from our graveyard, put it back into our deck, shuffle it up, and pretty much start all over again. We are going to be drawing 7 cards, everyone is, and it's really going to mess with the graveyard decks at the table. Choice of Damnations, yet another card he wanted in this deck, and another awesome one at that. Target opponent chooses a number. You may have that player lose that much life, but if you don't, that player sacrifices all but that many permanents, which is fantastic. It's permanents period, so they could really be stuck in an uncomfortable situation where they have to start sacrificing lands or the majority of their creatures. But it's really cool. They have to be careful. The number they pick may be the wrong number. This card is brilliant like that. Cultural Exchange, 6 mana, choose any number of creatures target player controls, and then you choose the same number of creatures another target player controls, and then you exchange those creatures. So these can be your creatures in exchange for someone else's creatures, or 2 different opponents are going to be exchanging their creatures. So really cool card, can definitely change the power at the table at that moment, give it to someone else, and change the game significantly. Whims of the Fates, everyone loves this card. Put all of your permanents into 3 different piles. Piles can include 0, so you can just put everything into 1 pile and then hope you're lucky enough to not have to sacrifice anything. Just pretty much go all in at that point. Cruel Entertainment, another awesome black sorcery. You choose target player and another target player. The first player controls the second player's turn during their next turn, and then the second player controls the first player during that first player's next turn as well. So it can include you, it doesn't have to include you. I think it's funny if you choose 2 of your opponents to do this with. That again is going to contribute towards the chaos of this deck, and it's a little bit more flavorful. As you can see, there's a pretty creepy puppet show going on there. Dimensional Breach, yet another card he mentioned. Remove all permanents from the game as long as any of those cards remained removed from the game. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, they get to return one of those removed cards they own back into play. So slowly, they might regain whatever board state they had, but it's going to start off with lands, and then it's going to go to artifacts or creatures. It's going to be slow, but it's definitely a pretty cool card. Goblin Game, yet another chaotic red sorcery. This one is basically just going to see who is going to end up losing half of their life or losing a certain number of life dependent on who can hide the most objects. It's not really significantly powerful. Someone is at the very worst going to end up losing half of their life, which isn't always a bad thing, but it's really just a fun card. Thieves Auction, some people have scooped because of this card as well. You set aside all cards in play, and then starting with you, each player chooses one of the cards and then puts it into play tapped under their control, and then you repeat this process until all of those cards have been chosen. So pretty much like a draft. This is also including lands, so it can be very time consuming depending on the size of your game. If it's 4-player, it might not take that long, but if it's anything more than that, look out. Insurrection, we do need some sort of way to win. Insurrection is never really a terrible way to win. You can at least knock out some players, but gaining control of creatures that you don't own, untapping them, having them gain haste is pretty cool. Scramble Verse, this one is a little bit more fair than Thieves Auction because it doesn't include lands, and there is a chance that someone doesn't end up with an even amount of creatures compared to someone else because it's chosen at random. There is a chance that someone could end up with all of the power that they didn't have before. It's a little bit more interesting. We of course have Blasphemous Act because we need some good removal in here, and this is some of the most efficient that you can find that's going to wipe the board. Cost reduction is just insane. And then we wrap up the deck tech with 4 instants: Swords to Plowshares, Vampiric Tutor, Chaos Warp, and Reigns of Power. Swords and Chaos Warp are pretty good instant speed removal cards. Swords is going to deal with a creature, Chaos Warp is going to deal with a permanent. Vampiric Tutor is kind of like Demonic Tutor but instant speed, and puts the card on the top of your library. Instead, you lose 2 life, so anything you want, instant speed, can't really beat that. And then we play Reigns of Power because it's kind of like Cultural Exchange. We're going to be giving control of our creatures to our opponent, or that same opponent is just going to be giving us all of their creatures because we might not have all of our creatures. We might just have an empty board to give them, so it can, in a very similar way, be a win con like Insurrection. So really cool card, definitely some good instants to have in the stack. But anyway, that's going to do it for the whole deck tech. Thanks again, Frogger Pirate, for being a patron for this long. I definitely enjoyed making this deck for you, and I enjoyed making all the past decks for you as well. Really cool idea here, Chaos in 5 colors. Not really something I was thinking about doing. I've made some Chaos builds before, I've made some Is It Chaos builds, but 5 colors just seems really cool, really out there. Feel free to leave any suggestions in the comment section below. Let me know what you think about it. As always, you guys have a wonderful day. Void here signing off. See you all next video.